Welcome back to SideQuest VIII. I should just say SideQuest 8. Episode 14, and back with me is my perennial companion and party member, not ever to be switched out or have his magic or GFs junctioned to some erstwhile other party member, Wes Schantz. Wes, good to see you. How are you doing?
I'm good. I'm good. But I think that means that I'm going to be losing my memory even more. Isn't that right? Isn't that what the GFs do?
Yes, I believe so. And
Sure.
as I've been going through Final Fantasy VIII, I've been looking more and more into the rather convoluted technological, mythological lore. And yes, these GFs, which seem to be junctioned to our minds and some way sort of bound to our souls, if we look at the mind-soul connection through a medieval or ancient lens or psychological lens. And yeah, as a consequence of these tremendous powers, we lose our memories. And so perhaps at some point when this concept gets borne out a little bit more, I can talk a little bit about international relations theory and how hegemons or large powerful nations can themselves lose their memories as their status within the world changes. Something it will perhaps be somewhat Orwellian. War is peace, and just the pieces moving on the board, and that dictating one's actions, and perhaps a determined Hamlet-esque way, perhaps a determinist way that our squall might be afflicted by, as we are
Hmm.
noting here. These more and more the concept of fate is mentioned, and so
Yes.
one thing I want to mention. So you mentioned the GFs and the potential that we'll lose our memory, but we've also learned in this section the nature of LNA's power, which is that she can enable people to experience other people's past.
Hmm.
And so it's something like a video game, right? There is a restriction in being able to experience somebody else's past. It's like being able to read one's narrative or seeing photos. One can see from that person's perspective, but one cannot alter the events that are occurring. And so one has a bounded freedom, a freedom to perceive, but not a freedom to be an agent. And perhaps that's the role of the video game player, in particularly an RPG where the story is set, but one just enables one's characters to play their roles, and oneself plays a role through these characters too. And maybe we'll have to talk about the ideal relationship between freedom and destiny, or boundedness and freedom within a video game, particularly RPGs, because this is a concept that's been explored quite a bit since Final Fantasy VIII, with
Yeah.
so-called open world RPGs coming to prominence, and then actually having seen their heyday being now sort of replaced by games like Clair Obscur, which have more linear
Hmm.
progressions in the RPG space. And so interesting how these things move. But all that just goes to say is that I'm looking forward to this conversation, and I thought that I might lead by just giving a brief outline of what I've seen, and then maybe you could do the same, because it
Hmm.
looks like in this time of side quests on disc 2, now that we have gotten our manner of transportation, or have now we have a manner of transportation that gives us the freedom to go over land and water. Now that we have that, we have the freedom to choose, and the game becomes less linear than it was. And we can, like our eponymous name here, we can go on side quests. Um, and you have chosen to do this following the guide that you sent to me. But me being the obstinate, lesser RPG player that I am, I decided to just randomly fly around, swim around, I guess sail around in my Balamb garden. And in my experience, I ran into Dollet and tried to play cards, but they have the random rule, which made it intolerable to play with me. Um, got out of there fast. And then I saw a large red garden lurking at what looked like Balamb to me. So I
Hmm.
went to check out what was going on there. And oh, I should say I'm jumping the gun just a little bit, because at the end of last time we were still at FH, and
Yeah.
Irving had joined us. So I went with Irving to try and cheer up Selfie. I chose to try and cheer her up. She found that quite weird. And then so I left Irving, who actually has a skill for cheering people up. He says, this stage that's been destroyed, oh, don't worry about that. These engineers and technicians, they can definitely fix that if they can fix Garden. He is,
Yeah.
I really marveled at him and thought of a personal friend of ours, David Oldham, when I thought of Irving. He truly has a skill for picking people up. He is a people person. That is not just, I think, an expression. It may be an orientation in the world, but it's certainly a set of skills as well. Squall does not have this skill. And I think we have seen this over and over again, and we will continue to see it as he moves into his more mature role here. And so what do we see happen? Well, Squall is elevated to battle commander. This is now a time of war, and Sid is a headmaster. And so he wishes to distinguish himself from what Garden needs now. And so it is not so much going to be a training ground for Seeds, though it will continue in that capacity under the stewardship of Quistis, who is now going to be something like a deputy headmistress. And Zoo will be the quartermaster, but now it is going to be a military. Garden is going to operate like a military vehicle and a military organization, even more so than it did when it was an educational center for, and also base for mercenaries. And so now training will continue, but the leadership is a wartime leadership. The so-called gates of Ares, gates of Mars are opened in Rome here, and which is interesting given the color of Galbadio, red, of course. And so Squall is made the commander, and so now he, like Cypher Idea, is running a garden. This perhaps also is this is a choice perhaps also made by Sid, because he wishes to recuse himself from a position where he is directly in conflict with his wife, Idea. I think even from a military standpoint, he understands, or perhaps especially since he is, of course, the headmaster of this place and ostensibly has the greatest strategic knowledge of anyone there in a Nestorian sort of way, knows that it could affect his judgment to fight against Idea, and that Squall, not having the memories that might set him in Idea's favor and set him against himself, will be the perfect choice for combating her, particularly if Cypher is on her side. He is all too used to fighting Cypher. I do think it's an interesting choice that Squall, who is just a level 4, in my case, seed, and who has not been a seed for very long, even within the context of the game, is chosen. This does make it seem like he is the choice of fate, and how Sid presents this to him bothers him because it sounds like it is so fatalistic. He gets upset, fights against Sid. He does that very violent gesture of this. And so again, there may be things that Sid knows that we do not. But continuing to move on, we then have a concert. And I think this is another instance of you probably playing smart and me playing not very smart. It was a travesty for me, and included 2 different melodies, Eyes on Me as well as a happy Irish jig. And so I didn't get the special dialogue with Renoa that I otherwise would have. I don't understand dialogue. And Squall says, I don't need you to understand me. And she says, oh no, I meant I don't understand how, how they're playing this so poorly. I usually love this song. And then they talk, and she ends up saying, Squall, why are you always like this? And you always have to be this way, and maybe you should try and rely on others a little bit more. And so again, Squall is pushed to grow, and particularly in his new leadership role, I think what people are trying to convey to him is that he can no longer be a child about how he manages his emotions and about how he manages his life. There are certain things he's going to have to think through and think about, certain choices he's going to have to make and manage the emotions that are consequent from them. And also, since he's managing an organization, he's going to have to deal with people who are reliant on major sectors of it, like Zoo, like Quistis. And Renoa is obviously offering to play some role in his life as well. And but all that said, in his dream sequence, or sorry, while he's in his bed, Squall does have some good responses to this.
Mhm.
No matter a very Buddhist sort of sad responses about the sad nature of the world, or the tragic nature of the world, as Unamuno would say, that even if you do attain high rank or great friends for some portion of your life in this world, that one does end up being alone and without all of the things one attains at some point. And though I think technically that doesn't have to be true, one can sort of still die surrounded by people. The cast of characters around people, it does constantly change, and it is true that one goes out of the world with none of what one had while in it. And so his sort of nihilistic perspective is not incorrect, but I think it is too childish in that now he has been thrust into the world. And even if that's ultimately true, he now has a role on the stage, even if he, like anybody, will ultimately be thrust off the stage and into obscurity and, Austin and, perhaps die alone. But that said, he's now the boss. A party is thrown for him, where Noah continues to try and develop with him. He continues to fight against it. It's like he's not only fighting it, it's as if he wants to reject his own mortality by rejecting the natural development that a character has to go through in order to mature. It's almost like a romantic concept. It's like, well, if I never, and he even thinks that through. He thinks this might be a defense mechanism, right? That if I never connect to people and never open up to them and never share my thoughts with them, I can never grow to rely on them, care about them, and then lose them and suffer the pain that is apparently unconsciously bubbling up in him from losing his sis, who we will later find out was Elene. And it's interesting that it's his sister, not his mother or his father, that has crushed him. In any case, yes, and a direct quote from him that I actually wrote down was, "Nothing lasts in this world." In any case, he has a dream sequence with that strange childlike music with the Charlie Brown shirt that you mentioned last time, where he says he'll make it even if he has to do it on his own terms. So it looks like the perspective that he has been housing during the majority of this game was actually first developed when he was like a 6 or 7-year-old kid. So not a particularly mature perspective. This is when I then went to Balamb, and Zell auto entered my team, and I actually had Quistis with me, and we go to his house and find that he has another T-board. Quistis tells a funny story that Zell quickly interrupts about how Zell once actually crashed his T-board into a girl's restroom. And so there's another bit of text you can get if you have special characters or if you do something right, like with the Renoa sequence during the concert. And I've actually just lost to Fujin and Raijin for the first time, but I'm going to go back through more intelligently and hit them in their weak spots and make sure I'm strong against their strong spots next time. They were much stronger than Cypher. So yeah, that's my little brief outline, Wes. I appreciate thank you for granting me the indulgence.
No, yeah. I mean, that's helpful because I wasn't really aware of all of the different dialogue options that are opening up at this point. But as you're describing it, it makes it really clear, why the game has been so linear up to this stage, because including so many other options is a ton of work. And then on the player's part, trying to track them down and keep track of them all is also a ton of work. So it's going to be tricky trying to bounce back and forth between the different timelines of events here, right? Like what would happen if you did this thing versus that thing, the ways that actions that you take on one playthrough impact other possibilities. So like, for example, as you said, I didn't go straight to Balamb, even though I saw that there's something parked there. It makes sense that it's Galbadia Garden. But I scooted right around it and went up north to the Shumi village side quest, which looked like a good one to start with. So I'm currently sitting in the middle of Shumi village and searching for some items that are, I mean, it's basically just like a kind of a parody of a fetch quest where in lots of video games you'll be told, go find this item that I need before you can progress to do the thing you actually want to do, you know, one of those kind of deals. And um, it seems like they're having some fun with that notion here. Um, but it is kind of tedious as the player to go through it. So I didn't quite finish it. But I did also spend a bunch of time playing cards because as you get the garden moving again, um, all of these people around garden start to talk about the card club, and it's abbreviated CC. So um, this lets you know that you're allowed to start to work your way up within the card club, and by playing the different members and beating them, you rise in your card club rank. So there's like a sort of shadow ranking system to the seed rankings, and I got all the way past the king of the card club, which turned out to be Quistis. So I am currently the king. I'm not only, you know, the commander of the garden for this assassinate the sorceress extended mission, but I am the king of the card club, and it's pretty rad. Um, I think uh, even with all that, um, I haven't actually like maxed out all the things that would be possible at this point. Like I mentioned, I haven't upgraded weapons. I haven't tried to like optimize all the different skills that the GFs can learn at this point, and you know the ways that they're allocated and junctioned and all this and that. Like I just that's a little bit too fiddly for me. I do have my limits on like how much time and effort I want to put into this, but I am trying to see kind of a broad, you know, range of possibilities by playing the game intelligently, as you say. Well, you know, at least within um, you know, certain definitions of that, and also looking at other people's playthroughs where they're recorded and all the dialogue is recorded, which is really helpful because yeah, I'm not like taking notes as I play. I try to look back at the dialogue and pick out lines and scenes that I think are significant here. So like you mentioned, we see a kind of reprise almost of the initial meeting between Squall and Renoa the night of the seed graduation, and
He's wearing a dress too, and
she's
all white, right?
it's the same kind of thing. Like it's nighttime in the garden, but there's even more of an emphasis on this is important for Squall and Renoa, right? It's set up as we're cheering up Selfie, right? And Irving does that, but it's almost like a way of luring Squall in, right? And he takes the bait. He suddenly uh, realizes like they have all done this for him, and that seems to really um, mess with his head a little bit. At least in most versions of the playthrough, he's going to come off as a real punk in the interaction with Renoa. It looks like you have to mix the song in just the right way, and it's actually not by getting the complete um, score of the quote unquote slow song, the Eyes on Me waltz or whatever, but you have to mix it with like I think this playthrough is saying that you have to mix it three of the one song and then one of the other song, the weird like jig music or whatever. So you have just enough of that jig going on with the Eyes on Me theme for the longer extended and very romantic dialogue to take place between Renoa and Squall. So I actually went ahead and just got the song to match, thinking that that would be the right thing to do. But I got the same dialogue as you, I think, which is like abbreviated and kind of cuts off with Renoa really uh, frustrated with Squall, the ways that he keeps putting up boundaries. The more they try to reach out, the more he pushes them away. And she kind of rage quits here and marches off. And he's like, I guess this is what I want. You know, I wanted to be alone, and that's safer and that's better. But as I say, this playthrough has got the longer quotes from their dialogue where um, the conversation goes on. She asks him about his dreams. She asks him what he wants to do with his life. And although he doesn't answer, he doesn't, say something that makes her quit in the same way. And the dialogue ends up saying that Renoa sort of respects his wishes, but she says that her dream is to basically have this moment and let it continue. So a kind of uh, interesting juxtaposition, right, of dreams. Like we saw Cypher's dream to be the knight of the sorceress, and now we're seeing that Squall, although he may have dreams, he's not going to express them, even when um, he's got just the right music playing. Uh, but Renoa, as usual, is very open with her feelings, saying that she and the others all love him. So that's a line that comes out in this dialogue, and that they want to take care of him, protect him, help him um, get through this together, and that they will, try to hold on to this moment. And it's visually a really striking moment too. So whichever dialogue you get, you're still seeing basically the same visuals, which is the two of them not on the dance floor, but she actually pushes him off of where Martine was sitting, I think, and where Irving left a naughty magazine to mark the spot. She pushes him down onto the solar panels, and so they are standing more or less reflected. But what's really visible is the night sky. So it's like you're kind of gazing down at this scene, but also up into the sky at the same time. Um, you're seeing those things that were associated so much with Dobe and his pacifist and dialogue style of leadership, right? And they are engaged in this dialogue on that surface, which is all about passivity, just absorbing energy. Um, and you sort of see that wish from Renoa that again they could stay together like this. Of course, that's impossible. The plot has to move ahead. They have to go on their mission. But I found that to be a really interesting, um, like parallel with the original meeting of them on the dance floor. Um, it's kind of silly. Like three of your party members are playing music. Um,
Never
eh,
having played.
yeah, yeah, and for whatever reason, after this all happens, Selfie is still out of commission. Um, there's this thing that Sid says before he kind of disappears, like he's no longer anywhere, as far as I can tell, within the garden. He says that she's opened her diary again. So if you go into um, the classroom, you can like read more of her diary, which I haven't done yet, so I'm not sure what she's up to. Um, but it does mean that your party is slightly limited here, and so it's kind of interesting thinking about like yeah the ins and outs of this sequence. Ostensibly, this concert was to cheer up Selfie, but the way that it plays out, she's actually still so kind of broken up about what has happened with the missiles and the Antrabia Garden that she is not a playable character at the point in the game that we're at, and we're not actually, as far as I know, actually going to visit Trabia anytime real soon. Um, I don't think that it's actually accessible. At least I didn't see it on my map. For whatever reason, Shumi Village does show up on the map though, so that's part of why I went there first. But it so it sort of um, is like in a way we have all these options, right? Like we can go anywhere on the map. Um, to progress the story, we have to do a certain thing, uh, going to Balamb and fighting Fujin Raijin. Um, but there's also certain things that are still not possible. You know what I mean? It's not like it's entirely open-ended. And again, I think that's important for everybody's sanity. Um, so so yeah, so that's where I'm kind of left off. The the card game stuff. I mean, I think it's kind of worth doing, but it's super time consuming. So I understand if you want to pass on it for now, but it is pretty satisfying to play cards in Garden right now because while you have the worst rule, I have one of the better rules, which is the difference rule. So instead of winning just one card, you win as many cards as you won the game by. So if I'm beating people by 3 or 4 cards, I'm getting 3 or 4 of their cards, and if I beat them by more than that, I get all of their cards. So I just am vacuuming up
I
high
have that
quality cards right
in
now.
Garden, but in Dollet they didn't. So
Yeah.
I like playing in Garden now. But you make me think some interesting things about both Renoa and Selfie. So just Renoa has now been shown in white when Squall has been in all dark or black, either his uniform, his formal uniform, or his normal outfit. Which this time he got away with just wearing his normal outfit to the concert, but she's wearing her all white sort of angelic get up, and I say angelic based on the angel wings on her usual blue outfit. But like you noticed, in the first time we ever see them interact, there we witness an astral phenomenon as well. The sky is also very prominent. We see fireworks. So there's and so in seeing the reflected night sky with her again in her sort of white angelic raiment, it's easy to make connections between her and something like a sky goddess. And so just to sort of assert Renoa's function here, insofar as she is being upset with Squall for refusing to grow up and to experience the Bildungs that will make this like a Bildungsroman video game. Uh, Ludus in Latin, I guess, but that's not German. She is fulfilling the function Jungians would call of being the anima in the male unconscious, which is the natural representation by a male of the female form that guides him into the world or inspires him to become a mature and skilled individual in order to win the affections of his ideal woman. And that this ideal woman is like a carrot within a man's imagination that draws him forward into the world. And so Renoa is acting in this function for Squall. Certain scholarly critics might thus criticize her role as being an incomplete embodiment or articulation of a real woman, and that she is just playing, that perhaps she is limited to just being a function of a male consciousness and a male representation of what a woman can do for him. And I think the nature of the genre might support that notion a little bit, that it was often young, like teenage guys who would play this game and for whom it was originally written and made. That said, it is interesting to see her associated with the color white and all white in this case, and also the stars and being both a romantic option, but also an option that is encouraging and instructing Squall on how to become a better version of himself, or the next version of himself. Again, this from a sentimental standpoint seems to be like the sort of nature pushing fate as a natural progress onto Squall, in the same way that sort of society and Balamb Garden and Sid, from a sort of patriarchal masculine perspective, is also pushing him into the world and into a role. And so not only is he becoming commander of this force, but he is becoming an adult person. And so part of managing a new rank and a new role is managing the emotions consequent from the role. And this may take a new strategy. And obviously his initial childish strategy was one that could only be born of having limited emotions and a limited necessity to express and delegate them. But that said, I wanted to contrast that with Selfie, about Final Fantasy VIII is that it doesn't admit of simple or simplistics, right? I think self for herself because everything in her world had just been destroyed. Trabia Garden had been destroyed, and now the one thing that she was doing are this stage very close to a breakdown. Even though I think the performances for Squall, it is a performative act. Everybody, and Irving in particular, who now we see has set his sights on Selphie, and perhaps creepily in her moment of vulnerability, but also perhaps heroically in trying to bring her up from her nadir and her depths. So it sort of depends on how one wants to look at him there. But they know that just like Trabia Garden, just like this stage has been shattered, so has Selphie. And so just doing anything right now is good for her. And I think the options for how this concert can go are indicative of her deteriorated mental state. Goes to her friends who openly Quista says she has no musical talent. And in fact, even as like a young player, you're probably like, what, you can't just play an instrument, even poorly, on command if you haven't done any learning. And yet Selphie is still with it enough to say, no, Renault, you've got a special role.
Yeah.
Part of the fact that the concert can be a travesty and can be put on very inexpertly is supposed to be indicative of Selphie's deteriorated mental state, and the fact that even doing this, she's trying to be good to Squall, but she does not have it together. And that partially why Sid might have asked you, or I think Quistis in this case, to give us Selphie a little time, might have been because of how that concert was performed. That it was just such a poor job and such a travesty that she just obviously was not okay yet. She needed to do it, but it itself indicated to her that Selphie is feeling the weight of having had her home destroyed, and also the weight of having to deal with her new home almost having been destroyed, and what that destroys when she looked and mature and saying that, no, we don't just have a concert and everything is okay. And in fact, there are indicators in the concert that things are not okay. And that the normal character all being like, but now hero of light, that, but it's not. And and I think from earlier Final Fantasies, particular 6 and 7, where mental health can be an issue, particularly 7 when Cloud is out. We still haven't had a death, and it seems like what's happening with Selphie is more serious than we are capable of dealing with. In the same way as Idea being too powerful for us to even be on really playing. Selphie's just she's got more going on than our team is capable of. Is showing that it's a team, and that is keeping her from joining it.
So sorry, there's some cutting in and out. I mean, I think I'm following the train of thought. Um, but yeah, I would just add that Irving and his creepy ways do seem to have identified Selphie as the girl for him. We are briefly playing as Irving in this portion of the game too. Like Squall goes back to report to Sid and leaves the organization of the show in Irving's and Selfie's hands. And you can actually like explore a little bit with Irving at this point, which is kind of goofy to think about. Like he just sort of abandons everybody at their rehearsal and runs off to see what's going on in Fisherman Horizon. Um, if you do that, you can see a weird like bit of dialogue with the guy who has the little tiny Moomba in his house. Um, he's called the Grease Monkey. He's one of the many mechanics, obviously. And there's a Galbadian soldier still there. Um, and instead of fighting the soldier, uh, you step outside to settle it outside, I guess. Um, and somehow the soldier is taken out. So when you go back in, the soldier's laying kind of knocked out on the floor. Um, and as Irving does, you search his pockets and find a bunch of ammo, including some of the best ammo in the game, which I guess is pretty rare, um, which is also necessary for making the ultimate weapon for Squall. So there's this like pretty well hidden little secret scene there um, that involves, being Irving and being kind of like uh, kind of exploratory, but also kind of creepy, kind of up to no good, kind of naughty. Uh, and I think there's a couple times here where Irving, we see like his internal uh, monologue or dialogue or whatever. He's thinking about how he's about to make his move. He's going to make his move. Um, and this feels a lot like the way that he kind of talked a big game about being a sniper and was unable to take the shot, right, without Squall kind of talking him through it. Uh, and even then, they fail in the mission, right? Um, so this kind of seems like an interesting juxtaposition with Squall's romantic relationship, right? Um, Squall, as much as he tries to push people away, they're attracted to him. Uh, and Irving, as much as he talks about how big of a ladies' man he is, he can't seem to get it together. In fact, he scampers off during the rehearsal to do this other weird thing, right? So there, depending on how you play, um, he's kind of a comical figure here. Um, now, we've seen a little bit of the backstory of each of the characters at this point, except for Irving. Uh, we don't really know what his deal is, um, and aside from his facade of being a guy who's into guns and women, um, we don't know who he really is, right? So I, I feel like um, with thinking about the kinds of leadership qualities last time a lot, this time the focus is much more on just the kind of personality, the kind of um, way of uh, you know managing, negotiating, just dealing with other people in an interpersonal kind of way. Um, and yeah, it's a really big like interlude moment within the game. There's nothing really pressing right now. Um, there's no immediate danger, at least apparent to us. Um, and so as I'm still like reading through all the different bits of dialogue that you can go and explore at this point by going to different parts of the world and talking to different people. Uh, it's kind of insane actually how much there is in this game that most players, if you're sort of just trying to be efficient and go from one thing to the next, um, there's so much in here that most players are never going to see. Um, so many little interactions amongst players, non-playable characters rather, um, that they're just there for fun. Um, and a lot of them have to do with um, romantic or sexual attraction in some way, shape, or form, which I guess is just part of the audience that this game was pitched to at the time. I don't know if it's all that interesting other than as a relic of that moment, but there's a lot of it.
Sex seems to still sell on recently redubbed HBO Max. This is one of the well-known truisms about their shows, and particularly old favorites like Game of Thrones, that they're the mixture of good storytelling and softcore pornography was a winning mixture. But I think any sort of entertainment, particularly visual entertainment and narrative entertainment, love stories are evocative and interesting. But yes, to your point, high school young men who need to take their roles in the world and are experiencing these deep and powerful new emotions may need some representations for how to do so in a cool way in these video games. But I wanted to mention, and I apologize for my internet connection going in and out. That was happening a little bit while you were speaking too, but more in the beginning rather than the end. So I too think I got what you were saying. But I was trying to say that, just in brief summary, that Selfie's putting together of what may have been a very farcical and travesty-like concert with people who were not musicians may have been indicative to Quistis that her mental state was not quite right, and that that whole sequence was supposed to show that Selfie was not going to be able to put herself back together in just a quick and easy way, in the way that more simplistic RPGs might just have a single event fix somebody. But something you said that I really like is that in this interlude, characters seem to be showing themselves for who they are. I think this will help us to understand the relationship between a person and their memory, right? These people who have certain memories of themselves and characters are now manifesting their beings in ways particular to how they manifest. It's almost like a Heideggerian Dasein. Like their personalities, they're doing what they do in these moments. Irving is being sort of a ladies' man who's actually overstating the case a little bit, but is more of a good wingman, really, than he is of a lady killer himself. But he's also helping Selfie out and got this stage rebuilt, and this helps Squall. And then he tries to put Squall in this situation that Irving would like to be in. And, you know, he's showing elements of being a good guy and a good friend while also still being a bit of a funny skis ball in certain respects. He is more like a Joycean fleshed out character in this respect. But we're getting this, without having the context you said, without having this history with him, we're getting to know what sort of person he really is through how he manifests when he's given some freedom to operate. Same thing with Quistis, right? Now she has taken on a more formal role within the garden where she is going to be responsible for education. She might not have been enough of a leader when it came to being a teacher, but she'll be a good administrator. And Zoo is also going to be an administrator and is taking this role. But you see also Renoa, and perhaps this supports our idea about her being more of a manic pixie fairy earlier, taking on this romantic role with Squall. She, of course, has no formal role within Garden. To me, it's unclear whether our initial relationship to her, our contractual relationship to her, is still operational. Is she still in charge of us, even though now we are the commander of the Garden? Is that contract still open? Are we still helping the Owls against the Galbadian army? It would seem that circumstances have changed so much, including the structure of the organization we are a part of. And yet, like you said earlier, the amount of boundedness that we're experiencing as opposed to freedom really is strangely juxtaposed, because even when Squall is given command, he says, and I have a picture of it here, so maybe I should actually quote it. It is a masterful bit of self-contradiction. I'll just have to do what I was told. Command the garden and kill the sorceress. So he has now been given ultimate command, but he was told to do so, and he wasn't given a choice. And so even when he argues with Sid says, "This is your destiny, and it is your or rather, this is your fate. It is your destiny to lead Garden and defeat the sorceress." Um, and so Squall, sorry, just getting the image again. Uh, you would think in now attaining this high position, he would be freer than before, but almost in a Tolstoy-esque way. And War and Peace, and Tolstoy makes this point that the greatest actors, against Carlyle's great man theory of world politics and history, the greatest actors actually have the least freedom because they play the tightest roles. And it would seem that Squall is experiencing some manner of this, even though now Balamb Garden can go in so many different directions, and we can play so many different side quests and experience so much. Choice in the matter when it comes to his role in this world and the direction the narrative will ultimately take is as limited as anybody that lives in time's choice for which direction time is going to move. Squall is being moved forward against his will or contrary to his will. Like Renoa, it seems like he would like to stay paused in time to some extent. At least if you get the good dialogue, which neither of us got during the dance sequence. I guess it wouldn't be too unbelievable if everybody played their part right. But so Squall is continuing, even though this again, like we talked about harmonious transitions, even though this should be a moment where the player feels exalted to some extent and like they finally attained to something. Insofar as this is just another rung on the ladder or spoke on the track, it's just like another step closer to doom, and is yet another indication that fate or destiny or some force outside one's will still has control over one's life. And so I think that continues to eat at Squall. Even though other people like Irving would be, focusing on the celebratory parts of this, there are deeper and darker implications as well that are not inappropriate, but that I think the mature person has to manage while also managing to celebrate and appreciate the efforts of one's friends.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the line comes from Sid at some point that it's his fate, right?
Yes, he says
And
that, and then he says it's your destiny. Very next line to lead Garden against the sorceress and defeat her. I have those too.
yeah, yeah, which is exactly what Squall does not want to hear, right? He is not cool with that. And I think that also is part of what really complicates his connections, his relationships with these other characters at this point, because of the differing levels of responsibility. Now, he is in some way trying to, you know, keep keep them safe, protect them, and yet, if needs be, they're going to be put in harm's way to further this mission, right? Because if we know anything about Squall, it's that he is completely dedicated to uh, whatever the mission happens to be, however arbitrary. Uh, as much as he might feel a certain way about that, he's going to do everything in his power to achieve the goal. So yeah, there's that is like right in front of us at this point, that problem of fate, of um, free will. The gameplay is saying one thing, right? You have many options. Choose whichever one you want. It doesn't really matter right now. But then beneath that, in order to progress, the game is also saying the other thing, right? You are strictly limited in how you can progress to actually see more of this story unfold. So I find that to be kind of an interesting puzzle when it comes to the ways that the story and the gameplay interact, right? Like they're very much letting the player have their cake and eat it too. And again, most players probably won't even realize quite how wide open all of these options are. Um, there isn't a lot that even would point you to be aware of that, because as you talk to people, at least the ones that I was talking to, they all sort of point you back towards Balamb, like that's the place to go. And if you sort of head straight out from where you finally get control of the garden, um, Balamb is basically a straight shot directly ahead. So the likeliest thing is that you either accidentally back up and go straight back into Fisherman's Horizon, which is fine, or you go straight to the next step on the sequence of like main plot line. Um, Now, yeah, I don't know if um, you were ever like super bothered by the question of fate and free will growing up. I personally feel like that's a fairly like uh, almost developmental stage, right? Like the sort of thing where like as you're becoming aware of yourself and becoming self-conscious, right around that same time, you're probably starting to worry about like whether you are actually in control at all, or whether you are some sort of um, you know, cog or brick in the wall, or whatever metaphor you want to substitute there. um, and I mean, I think working with kids, that is something that is pretty universal. So I find this, while it's like an extreme case of it, right, of Squall being told that to his face and being put in this position, um, it's actually um, fairly, uh, fairly universal. Yeah. So anyone could relate to this, I think.
So I'm sorry, I got probably half of what you were saying, and I think the sense, but I didn't I missed if there was a question or not
Oh,
in there.
just if you had ever experienced this problem of fate and free will in a like a really visceral kind of way, the way that Squall seems to, um, maybe when you were around his age.
Okay, so I'll say two things about that. One way that I experience that relates to an image that reoccurs to me often from Final Fantasy VII, which is from your time in one's time in Midgar, in that sort of abandoned playground. And I think of that abandoned playground as a metaphor for growing up, and where one sort of, as the last child, sees the place for what it is, but as a space. As a child, I wanted that space to last forever. I I wanted to be able to be a child in some ways forever, but I also acknowledged that the nature of being a child, and I realized this at a Chuck E. Cheese's, where I heard their quote or their catchphrase where a kid can be a kid, and I thought, but the nature of being a kid is preparing to be an adult. I was like, there's no the nature of being a kid is to grow and to develop and to mature and to become. It is constant striving. And I think this is something a lot of people forget about being a kid. I was uh I guess lazy in some ways, but I was almost always like working to become an adult in some way or another. And so something that struck me as strange as a kid, and I also considered this when I was like an 8 or 9 year old and I wouldn't go to the gym, and I thought about, if I had a genie, would I wish to just be strong and not have to go to the gym and go through all this suffering? Something that I realized is part of the nature of the things that we love is the essence of our being. And the fact that we develop relationships in school, for example, we don't necessarily like school, but the fact that we have to learn and we can't just automatically learn things helps us to develop relationships. Or the fact that we don't just manifest as perfect beings, but have to grow, and it takes a certain amount of time. The limitations on our being, what messed me up as a kid and continues to mess me up in a Heraclitean fashion, I would say, is that it is precisely these limitations on our being that Squall is trying to buck against, that give meaning to the interactions in our lives. So the fact that it takes me time to learn makes me value my learning. The fact that I have to spend time with you making these recordings in order for them to exist makes me value our time together. If I could just have all of this, or if I could just be strong without working out, there would be no marginal utility to it. Is like the money on the table. It imposes the necessary aspect of the game that makes the game meaningful. And so I've always had a problem with fate and the limitations of my being because they exist, and I hate that. But it also makes us that without those, the nature of my being would be distinctly different. And I can't even know what would bring me happiness or pleasure. Death and friends, reading. I know that there are certain pleasant things in this world, and or like doing good to a student or something like that that I can't access. But if I were timeless in some way, or not subject to ill health, I don't know that that would necessarily make me better, or the experience of existing better, even though it might be longer or less painful in some way or another. So that's been a perennial problem of mine, Wes, is what I should say.
Okay. That's good. I mean, I think that speaks to your kind of deep engagement with philosophy and literature, because it seems to haunt a lot of people one way or another, and provoke a lot of great, artistic productions, great scholarly productions or philosophical productions as well. Yeah, and I kind of wonder, in much the same way that Final Fantasy VII seems to be about dealing with death and the, cataclysm of climate change, environmentalism, things like that. Final Fantasy VIII seems much more to be interested in this process of growing up, of falling in love, in finding a life's dream or a life's purpose for oneself that is meaningful, right? So sort of that zone. And I'm kind of interested in the way that we kind of move from the one to the other. So it's cool that you picked up on that, that early on in Midgar, early on scene of the playground, as a point of connection there.
I still think that I might be the last person hanging out in that playground. That I'm still obstinately trying to deny the passage of time. But the problem with that is that one's feeling stops being rooted in reality and becomes rooted in the past and becomes sentimentality and nostalgia, right? And I define sentimentality like the Jungians in feeling an emotion inappropriate to the current time because it is an emotion in reaction to a past situation. And so that emotion is no longer appropriate. It's like a theatrical representation, right? If I feel sad about having been mean to somebody 7 weeks ago and I'll never see them again, it's not useful to feel sad about. It's useful to not be mean to the person in the first place. So sometimes sentimentality is seen as an inappropriate adaptation of one's emotion to contemporary circumstances. So it's like one is constantly chasing the past, reflecting on the past and situations in which one acted in an unadapted way and one has to make up for that by feeling the appropriate shame for those actions now, or something like that. In any case, I so even though I do, I would say, engage with the limitations of my existence, it's I think because I dislike limitations of any sort, and particularly embodied by authority early in life and still, but also because I wonder whether I am still like a child fighting against these limitations, and perhaps still find myself in a playground where, well, I should have gotten on with life a long time before that. But so it could be indication of both a good thing and a bad thing concurrently happening, like health and unhealth, as it were. That said, well, we should probably, and I think we'll do this off camera because we've gotten, I think, pretty close to our limit for today and when we can go till. We'll have to figure out whether we're going to coordinate our playthroughs or indulge in a couple extra side quests and just bring in various extra information, because it sounds like both ways could be valuable. Seeing as nobody can play, or neither of us are intending to be 100% completionists, we might be able to bring differing things into the milieu. That said, I'm very happy to play some side quests. Oh, one thing I will say from earlier is that if one does go along the main path and I find Ragin and you have to use a dog to do this in Balamb, it's something that a strategy guide is very helpful for. After going through the Balamb segment, the next story segment is Travia. And so,
Oh, okay, nice.
So yeah, so it will eventually, um, but when that is, it needs to happen.
All right. Yeah. Well, let's
Well,
coordinate a little bit.
I'm looking forward to it, my friend, and have a wonderful afternoon.
Okay, you too.